In this video, we discuss 4 traps you can use to win as black in the Ruy Lopez. Let's just jump right in. Our first trap is called the fishing pole trap, and it happens after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, our classic Ruy Lopez setup. And it happens in the Berlin defense after black plays knight f6. Before we really get into the trap, it's really important for me just to explain one thing about the Ruy Lopez. In this scenario, the only defender of this e5 pawn is the knight, and if you're playing white, or if you don't really know that much about the Ruy Lopez, you might think that after bishop takes, pawn takes, white wins this pawn because it's hanging. The problem with this position is that the queen comes here and is basically forking the pawn and the knight and is going to win one of those pieces. And so it's really important, especially if you're new to the Ruy Lopez, that you understand that in some positions it looks like white is only a couple moves away from winning a pawn, when in reality, let me go back to the right move, when in reality that's just not the case. So our first trap happens in this position, the Berlin defense, when white plays the very common move, castle kingside. Here, black can play knight g4. The purpose of the move knight g4 is to bait white into playing h3. h3 trying to push this knight off that square. In this position, instead of moving the black knight to a safe square, black plays h5. The idea is that after h takes g4, h takes g4, black has opened up the h file and it has a great route to the white king, and white has to spend a tempo moving their knight to safety. So for instance, after knight e1, black has queen h4, threatening checkmate. And let's say white were to try and open up an escape square for the king, for instance by playing f3 so the king could sneak out this way in the event of the queen coming to h7, h2, or h1. Black can just simply stop this by playing g3, and at this point the game is completely lost for white. Black is going to checkmate on either h2 or h1 in the coming moves. So that is the fishing pole trap. The second fishing pole trap is very similar in concept, it just happens from a little bit different setup. So we get into the Ruy Lopez, and instead of going to the Berlin, we go into the Mortimer defense. And it only happens after the exchange here. So after bishop takes c6, d takes c6, again, white cannot capture this pawn because black's going to have the pin with the queen here on d4. So white elects to castle, and this is probably the most common move for white in this scenario. And after white has castled, the threat of this pawn getting taken is a very real threat. So here, black plays bishop g4, very logical move, pinning the knight to the queen, and then white plays the very logical h3, basically pushing the bishop off that square, and once the bishop moves off that diagonal, for instance, like if the bishop came back to e6, then the knight would be able to pick off the pawn. Here, instead of moving the bishop at all, black's going to play h5, very similar to what we just saw with the knight, with the previous position. After h takes g4, h takes g4, knight takes e5, queen h4, it's the same idea. Black has opened up the h file, and there's really nothing white can do. They try and push f3, g3, and you're going to just be checkmating on that file. So that is the kind of the second version of the fishing pole trap. The third trap is one of my favorites, and it's called the Mortimer Trap. And so let's set up the Ruy Lopez. Here in this position, again, the Berlin defense from black. And we talked about how we can do the first fishing pole if white castles kingside. Another common move for white in this position is d3. Right here, black can bait white into what's called the Mortimer Trap. And the way black does that is by playing knight e7. And so the idea is that this pawn is completely undefended, and if white is greedy and if they don't know the Mortimer Trap, they'll often take this pawn. So this is a great trap to use in blitz games when your opponent may not have, be thinking about all their opening preparation and is just going to go for the quick material. So this is a losing position for white right here, and the reason is black has c6. So how do you respond to this? If the bishop moves back, right? If white wants to protect the bishop, doesn't really matter what square. Let's say they go to a4. Black has queen a5, and now we're just threatening all these different pieces. This is a huge problem for white. So no matter what white does, they block check, they're going to be down a piece. So here is black already up a piece in the so early in the opening. And if the bishop came to the this square, it would be the same thing. The queen would just come out and fork. So what is the best move for white in this position? The best move for white is actually knight c4. And this is great if you're playing black in this position. Do not take this bishop. You will fall prey to a humiliating smothered mate. That is checkmate right there, so you don't want to fall for that as black. Instead, in this position, there's a couple things you can do. You can push d6, and the pawn covered by the queen will take away that square from the knight. Or better yet, you can kind of develop a piece and let your bishop control the diagonal. What's going to end up happening here is the bishop's going to have to move back, and you're going to fork the knight and bishop anyway, and you're going to end up picking off a piece, really no matter what happens. So the Mortimer Trap, again, in the Berlin defense, you retreat your knight in the hopes of kind of baiting your opponent to pick off the pawn. A great trap, and something that, in my experience, works really well. This next trap is a favorite that kind of wins you a piece nice and early. So we'll set up the Ruy Lopez, and it happens out of the Morphy defense, and after the bishop a4 response, which is probably the most common response you'll see. So after knight f6, castle kingside, Usually in this position, black will move their bishop out either to e7 or to c5. In this position, to set up this trap, black's simply going to play d6. And what d6 does is it really baits your opponent into playing d4. The point being, this knight is pinned, and white, if they could just move a piece anywhere on the board, they would love to move this pawn right to this d5 square to just pick off this knight. So noting that the center is a little bit weak, that is what white's going to go for. So a lot of times when you get in this position as black, you're almost guaranteed your opponent's going to play the move d4. Here, white has to play b5. You remember you got to relieve that pin so that this knight can become active. And after bishop e3, the next move for black is super crucial. You do not want to make this mistake as black of taking the d-pawn with your pawn. What happens in this position is white plays knight g5, and now the bishop and the knight working together to attack f7 is just too much for black, kind of ruins the black position. So in this position right here, again, do not make the error of taking with the pawn, rather take with the knight. And after knight takes a knight, pawn takes knight, queen takes, black gets a couple tempos to win a bishop. So after c5, the queen's going to come back, and then black has c4. So because the queen ended up on d4 there, black can push the pawn twice with tempo, and the bishop usually falls. So this is how it'll usually play out. And here in this position, black's up a piece and clearly winning right in the opening. So the next trap happens in the bird defense, which in this position right here, black will play knight d4. As someone who plays a Ruy Lopez, I always get so annoyed when my opponent plays this, just because I don't really know the lines that well. And I was really excited to kind of learn this trap because I think it'll help me play this. I'm going to start playing this as black, I think. So after bishop a4, bishop c5 from black giving up this pawn and really baiting white into capturing this weak pawn. So after knight takes e5, queen e7, you can see kind of what's going on here for black. Black's getting their pieces developed, they're getting their queen right on the center e-file here. White doesn't want to move the knight away, because if they do, then the pawn falls with check. So a logical move for white is f4. And here black plays the really tricky f6. Why is this a tricky move? It seems very logical, but normally you wouldn't want to be opening up this diagonal to the king. Oftentimes, especially in blitz games or white just jumps right on this diagonal with their queen. And so the move queen takes h5 looks like a good move for white, but it's actually a huge mistake. After g6, white's going to take the pawn, and the reason why they're taking the pawn is that the queen is pinning the h-pawn to the rook, so that white's kind of thinking, oh, if black decides to take the knight, then I'll just pick off the rook. The problem is that in this position, black has the move queen e4 check. Where's the king going to go? Let's say the king goes to d1, black's threatening checkmate in 1. The only thing stopping checkmate in 1 is going to be the queen on this diagonal. And so in this position right here, you simply take the knight, and if the queen is going to go for the rook, then you'll have checkmate, so that's fine. The queen obviously can't take the pawn. And so what does the queen do in this position? The queen kind of has to stay on this diagonal. And so let's say the queen moves here, controlling this square, then the knight comes out, and there's really nowhere for the queen to go. Each of these light colored squares is protected by black, and so the queen comes back, and you end up getting checkmate. In this position right here, white can salvage the position, and they do that by playing the really counterintuitive knight c3. The knight covers this square right here, and after rook takes, knight takes, black is up a piece and just really in a much better position. This next trap is kind of similar to the last one I showed you, so we'll just get right into it. So we'll get into our Ruy Lopez, and this happens after bishop b4, which I think is called the Alakan Defense, but comment if I'm wrong about that. I think it's the Alakan Defense. The great thing about this one is that anytime you play bishop b4, white is almost always going to play c3. And after bishop a5, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and now knight takes e5. The reason why white can get away with capturing this pawn is because the c3 pawn takes away the d4 square. Black can't come to d4 with their queen and fork the knight and pawn because the c3 pawn covers it. So this is a pretty common sequence of moves you'll see played after black plays bishop b4 and then bishop back to a5. So it's a very common position is what I'm trying to say. Here, black plays bishop e7, and after d4, f6, again, very similar to what we just went over. Queen h5, taking advantage of that diagonal, and then g6. And this is another example where knight takes g6, looks like a good move, but the problem is queen takes e4. And after blocking queen takes e4 with something like bishop e3, black has a really fantastic bishop g4. Now that the queen has to move, there's really no way to deliver check. Like if the knight were to take the rook, the bishop would just take the queen. And so the queen doesn't really have any good squares. Probably the best square for the bishop is simply to come across and take the bishop that's hanging over here on a5. After queen takes g2, white's got to defend their rook, so rook f1, and then we get queen f3. And so this is just very powerful for black here. They're threatening checkmate, obviously, on e2. They're threatening checkmate here on d1, and so the only move for white that doesn't lose immediately is king d2. But after queen d2, king c1, queen takes f1, king c2, queen d1, checkmate. So that is a trap that results in checkmate. A little bit harder one to get, but I think if we go back all the way to the kind of the beginning of this, I think if you are going to play bishop b4, I played this actually just in preparation for this video, played this a couple times, and this was definitely the position I got into. I did get into this position, but my opponent moved their knight back, gave up the pawn, and traded queens off. So now, you're not always guaranteed that these traps are going to work, but when they do work, they're a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comments if you found this helpful. Thanks so much for those of you who have liked and subscribed to these videos, and thank you for your support. New content coming every week. You won't want to miss them. See you next time.